Hello students, we've been looking into the chapter of three orders where we saw that how agriculture was changing the social setup within the society of Europe and primarily in England and France, and how the enormous amount of importance which agriculture had naturally stemmed from the fact, and it would not have been possible without the person who would own the vast tracts of lands, because he would be the one who would be producing the maximum, the one who would have the most land under his control. And yesterday we saw that apart from the social factors which were responsible in the 10th and the 11th and the 12th century, there were certain other environmental factors also that were responsible for the social life that people led in Europe during that point in time. So today we yesterday we had seen the environmental reasons. Of course, today we look into land use. Okay, so initially agricultural technology was very primitive. Yes, no surprises there, we all know that. The only mechanical aid available to the peasant was the wooden plow drawn by the team of oxen. Something unfortunately something that happens in India even today, and it does not happen in Europe anymore. But yes, we are not as prosperous as them, so we continue with the tradition of using animals in our fields. This plough could at least, at best, scratch the surface of the earth and was unable to fully draw out the natural productivity of the soil. Agriculture was therefore very labor intensive. Fields had to be dug by hand, often once in 4 years, and enormous manual labor was needed. And also, an ineffective method of crop rotation was in use. The land was divided in half. One field was planted in autumn with winter wheat, while the other field was left fallow. Fallow, that is where you allow the land to regain its fertility. Rye was planted on this piece of fallow land, and next year, while the other half was put to fallow. That is, there was a kind of a crop rotation whereby you would not be utilizing or making the maximum use of the land under your control all in one go. You would use half of it this time, the other half next time, and that's how you would rotate. Because when you have to understand, this is something which is very very basic and elementary, that even in the process of farming, the land needs to regain its fertility. And you have to understand that in those years there was nothing called fertilizers, right? Everything was it was only about manure, which would be either whether cow dung or the horse dung or something like that. That is what was the only ingredient which worked towards enhancing the fertility of the soil. And everyone would not be having as many number of animals to actually take care of that. And the other very important reason was also that it was not a market intensive thing, where you have to understand one very important thing, students, here, that today, I have said this repeatedly in other chapters as well. Today we live in a world whereby you do not produce anything what you consume through the day. I do not produce anything that I consume through the day, and rest of the people who probably would be watching this video, neither do they, right? So, but in earlier times, that is about a few hundred years ago, we would be producing everything. We would be producing at least some of it. Okay, probably would be growing some vegetables, probably would be growing some food grains, something or the other. Probably I would be having a few cows where I would be having a sufficient amount of milk for myself, whereby which I would be able to sell that milk in the local market of whatever is left after my family has already consumed it. And similar would be the story with the people who would be probably growing vegetables. Once they have consumed what they needed, and the rest, what is left for the day, they would be selling in the market in the evening. So that's how the world works. So people were not very very particular about the maximum yield from the land that they had and all of that, because everyone was producing something. We today we live in a world whereby you live in probably some society, I live in some society, and none of us do anything throughout the day except probably watching television and Netflix and Hotstar. Yes, of course, and that is how it is. So everything has to be produced in great quantity, abundant quantity, so that it can be utilized by everyone, because no one is producing it except the farmers. So we have outsourced that food production part to a certain section of the society. So in earlier times, you could get away with it. Also, in today, you feel that it was a very ineffective method of crop rotation, and everything was very, very ancient, and there was no progress that was being made. But you have to understand one very important thing. That is something which you have heard since you were very young. That necessity is the mother of invention. They did not need it. It was not necessary for them to grow in abundance, right? They're in 10th century, 11th century, 12th century students, most of the economy was subsistence economy, where you just worried about if you had sufficient produce for your own family, and whatever was left, something to be sold in the market, and you were okay with it. Because you have to understand, students, no one was interested. There was no television, there was no air travel, no one had to no one needed to have a destination wedding in Missouri or Goa, for that matter. So people were happy with whatever they had. So from retrospectively, when you look at it from today's point of view, it appears to be that everything was bad, and they were probably living in stone ages, and nothing was modern, nothing was being achieved. But you have to understand one very important thing, that they were happy with whatever they had, because they didn't quite need it. New agricultural technology. But by 11th century, there is evidence of several technological changes that were being made. Uh, Instead of the basic wooden plows, cultivators began using heavy iron-tipped plows and moldboards. These plows would dig much deeper, and the moldboards turned the topsoil properly. With this, the nutrients from the soil were better utilized. The method of harnessing animals to the plow improved. Instead of the neck harness, the shoulder harness came into use. This enabled animals to exert greater power. Horses were now better shod with iron horseshoes, which prevented foot decay. There was increased use of wind and water energy for agriculture. More water powered and wind powered mills were set up all over Europe for purposes like milling corn and pressing grapes. Students, uh, you know, uh, I would like to explain it here. I hope you can understand, because I cannot explain it on the board. Uh, I, I I wonder how many of you have seen, horse plowing the fields. We all have seen the oxen plowing the fields, but I wonder how many of you have seen horses plowing the fields. But you all have seen horses, of course, in life. Okay, now you can understand there is a basic difference in what a horse looks like and what an oxen looks like, and the plow that we are talking about, जो हल जोतने की बात करते हैं, and the wooden plow that is there, if you have seen, definitely you have seen it for in case of oxen. You keep it on, it is actually there firmly on its neck. Okay, and it gets it has a very naturally, it gets blocked there, because of the hump which is there on, which is there where the neck ends. Okay, the natural hump which is there in oxens, because of which you see the plow kind of actually gets very nicely fits there. But horse is not built by mother nature like that. It has a very smooth finish, right? If you put any plow on it which you use an oxen, now the horse would just slip through. You would not be able to plow your field at all. Not just that the horses are not powerful enough, but you would not be able to plow the field properly, because it would keep slipping. And it was only much later, when a different kind of plow was invented, whereby, if you have seen, if you can probably look into some Google or some images somewhere, then you would see the basic difference between what I'm talking about, essentially. And that is what they are saying, that now the horses were brought, but they have skipped the part here that it became possible only when a typically and a very intelligently designed plow was invented, which would actually fit into the horses. Okay, and then the plowing became possible to use it. But of course, I can't blame you, because we had abundance of oxen, and we in India, even at that point in time, the horses were never popular with us. Because we have always used oxen. We have never used, our farmers have not used horses to plow their fields. They've always used for it to, for transportation and everything, but not to plow fields. So there were also changes in land use. The most revolutionary one was the switch from two-field to a three-field system. In this, peasants could use a field 2 years out of three if they planted it with one crop in autumn and a different one in spring a year and a half later. That meant that the farmers could break their holdings into three fields. They could plant one with wheat or rye in autumn for human consumption. The second could be used in spring to raise peas, beans, and lentils for human use, and oats and barley for the horses. The third field lay fallow. Each year they rotated the use among the three fields. If you remember, we just covered whereby the land was divided into two, whereby it was, then that's how the rotation was. But now, at that point in time, it was 1:1, and now it became 2:1. Okay, so when two parts of the land that you had was under cultivation, one part was kept fallow so that it could regain its fertility, because last time you had used the same plot of land. Okay, so this time you are allowing it to rest. Okay, with these improvements, there was almost an immediate increase in the amount of food produced each unit of land, and food availability doubled. The greater use of plants like peas and beans meant more vegetable proteins in the diet of the average European and a better source of fodder for the animals. For cultivators, it meant better opportunities. They could now produce more food from less land. The average size of a peasant's farm shrank from 100 acres to 20 to 30 acres by 13th century. Holdings which were smaller could be more efficiently cultivated and reduce the amount of labor needed. This gave the peasants time for other activities. And some of these technological changes cost a lot of money. Peasants did not have enough money to set up watermills and windmills. Therefore, the initiative was taken by the lords. But peasants were able to take the initiative in many other things, such as extending arable land. They also switched to the three-field rotation of crops and set up small forges and smithies in the villages, where iron-tipped plows and horseshoes were made and repaired cheaply. So, students, this is what it is. Tomorrow we will be starting this topic, the fourth order, new towns and townspeople. Thank you. Good morning, students. We've been looking into the chapter of three orders. We also saw how the society in Europe was evolving during 9th, 10th, and 11th century. We started with the fact that, yes, how important agriculture was, it still is now, but we started with the fact that, yes, people started living in manorial states, and it was the nobility which was the which remained the most powerful order in the European society. The nobility, the aristocracy, they remained the most powerful in the European society. But we were also, yesterday we started seeing that, yes, things started changing once the agricultural technology started changing, because more and more people were now living in towns and cities, and they were naturally in towns and cities. They were not farming. They had started engaging themselves in other activities which were related to trade. And so naturally, you had to now feed them as well, and they had the money, of course, to buy whatever you would produce. So naturally, the agricultural technology also started improving, because now more and more people had to be fed from the same area that was available for farming. Okay, and today we look into the topic of a fourth order, new towns and townspeople. Expansion in agriculture was accompanied by growth in three related areas: population, trade, and towns. From roughly 42 million in 1000 AD, that is, Europe's population stood at 62 million around 1200, that is, in 200 years, it went up to about 20 million and 73 million in 1300. Better food meant a longer lifespan. By 13th century, an average European could expect to live 10 years longer than in the 8th century. Women and girls had shorter lifespan compared to men because the latter ate better food. The town of the Roman Empire had become deserted and ruined after its fall, but from 11th century, as agriculture increased and became able to sustain higher levels of population, towns began to grow again. Peasants who had surplus grain to sell needed a place where they could set up a selling center and where they could buy tools, and cloth. This led to a growth of periodic fairs and small marketing centers, which gradually developed town like features: a town square, a church, roads where merchants built shops, and homes and office where those who governed the towns could meet. In other places, towns grew around large castles, bishops' estates, or large churches. So now you see that the world was moving outside the manorial states. The word was the peasants were, yes, of course, they suddenly had not become rich, but their minds had started wondering, that they now wanted better things in life. They now wanted to look at the world which existed beyond those manorial states. Okay, now naturally, as the agricultural technology improved, the production also improved. Now students, say for example, if I am a farmer and I grow say 50 kilograms of wheat every month, but because of the agricultural technology, my production goes up, that is the wheat production goes up to say 250 kilograms per month. Do you think I would be, or my family would be able to consume that? Certainly not. Now I would start looking for an opportunity to sell the surplus production which I have to the market. Okay, and then I'll start looking for the market and looking for better opportunities to do that. Then I'll start getting in touch with the traders who can actually buy my stuff and then sell it to the market. And probably there comes a time that I like what the traders do and I want to be a trader myself. And this is what was happening within the society. From peasants, they started first selling the surplus in the small fairs, जो कि हमारे शहरों में भी छोटे छोटे बाजार जो लगते हैं, मंगल का बाजार, ये बाजार, वो बाजार. Similarly, in small fairs, and then gradually they started venturing into bigger areas, whereby they also felt that yes, why not become a trader myself rather than selling it to a third person, whereby he takes a percentage cut and I get less. So rather than that, I would like to become a trader and a seller or a shopkeeper myself and make more money. And this is what was happening because the towns were expanding. And as I just told you, that you do not do farming within towns, right? Because you do not have space for that. So naturally, more and more people were getting into trade. The towns were expanding. The different people now were engaging in different activities as well. Because now there were offices which were created. There were church towns, large cathedral towns. All of them started happening, and the society was undergoing a churn where a lot of things had started happening. In towns, instead of services, people paid a tax to the lords who owned the lands on which the town stood. Towns offered the prospect of paid work and freedom from the lord's control for young people from peasants' families. Town air makes free was a popular saying. Many serfs, this is very important, many serfs craving to be free ran away and hid in towns. If a serf could stay for 1 year and 1 day without his lord discovering him, he would become a free man. Many people in towns were free peasants or escaped serfs who provided unskilled labor. Shopkeepers and merchants were numerous. Later, there was need for individuals with specialized skills like bankers and lawyers. The bigger towns had populations of about 30,000. They could be said to have been formed as the fourth order. Now you see that the whole, now even in towns, you had the bankers and lawyers. Now you can imagine 11th century, 12th century, so much had started happening, that so much of expansion was happening. People, especially the young people, started abandoning those manorial towns and estates and started migrating towards the cities. What they would do, they didn't know it themselves, but they started migrating towards the cities and started picking up menial jobs. Uh, some would be riding the carts, some would be as carpenters, whatever whatever actually, some construction workers, anything, because now towns were expanding, a lot of people were coming in, and everyone needed something. So you just had to fill the gap. Yeah. By 11th century, new trade routes with West Asia were developing. West Asia, that would mean the countries like, say, Israel, countries like, or rather the areas like Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Turkey, all these places. Uh, Scandinavian merchants were sailing south from North Sea. Scandinavian merchants would mean the merchants coming from Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, these countries. In France, by 12th century, commerce and craft began to grow. Earlier, craftsmen used to travel from manor to manor. That is, we studied about the manorial state, students, so don't now start wondering what is it about. Now, they found it easier to settle in one place where goods could be produced and traded for food. As the number of towns grew and trade continued to expand, town merchants became rich and powerful and rivaled the power of nobility. Now, this is something which was an important event which started to happen, whereby you have to understand the nobles, the nobles, actually I'm sorry, not nobles, but nobles were who lived in those manorial states. There was a time when the whole power was concentrated there, because you have to understand the nobles had also to take care of soldiers. They had to keep a certain number of soldiers, and you also had studied in this chapter that the knights were there, right? So all of that was there, because they were the ones who used to provide security to the society, and only then you could have uh, your trade. You can carry on with your trade and agriculture without any headache, because all that needs a security, and it has always been so, even today for that matter. Imagine, students, if you do not have Indian Army, then where would you be left with? So just imagine what China and Pakistan would do to you if you do not have Indian Army on the borders, and if you do not have the police to guard your internal borders. That is within the society. That is, so all that was needed, and only then you can carry on with your activities of trade and commerce, because that needs security, and only then people invest money. Only then people think about expanding their business. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. If you know that the moment you venture out with a pocket full of money and you would be looted, you would not be interested in that market anymore, because you would feel that market to be too risky, and people would not like to spend the money that they have. They do not want to attract undue attention of the robbers. Okay, so that is how it was. Now, so that is what they are now saying, that the traders had also started becoming very influential, because naturally now they had started earning a lot of money. Of course, the nobles were always powerful, students, because remember one very important ingredient which they had, which the traders did not, that they had the soldiers, they had their knights. So at the end, they would have the last say, but then, yes, the business class, the business community had started becoming more and more powerful and influential. Cathedral towns, we would start tomorrow. Student, cathedral towns, the topic, we would start tomorrow. Thank you. Good morning, students. We have been seeing in this chapter of Three Orders how the society of Europe was changing over the ninth and 10th and the 11th and the 12th century. How agriculture, of course, being very, very important, but then still the whole ecosystem of agriculture was changing around it, right? When it started as hunter gatherers, and then it became, the whole agriculture was concentrated and the agricultural activity was concentrated around manorial states. And then how, as the town started evolving and more people started shifting towards the town, how even that uh, power equation changed. Okay, so today we start the topic of cathedral towns. Now, first we need to understand what are cathedrals. Cathedrals would be essentially, if you look at into a very common definition of it, they are massive churches which are huge. Okay, and that is what we call cathedrals. Okay, you see churches all around you in Missouri and Dehradun also. They are large churches, but cathedrals are something else. Cathedrals would be massive churches. Okay, huge churches. So I wonder if you have cathedrals in Dehradun or even Uttarakhand for that matter, because they are massive churches, huge churches, and they have massive campuses, that kind of stuff. So one of the ways that rich merchants spent their money was by making donation to churches. From the 12th century, large churches called cathedrals were built in France. These belonged to monasteries, but different groups of people contributed to their construction with their own labor, material, or money. Cathedrals were built of stone and took many years to complete. As they were being built, the area around the cathedrals became more and more populated, and when they were completed, they became centers of pilgrimage. The small towns developed around them. Guys, even in India for that matter, since time immemorial, for thousands of years, we all know that there are many towns in India which owe their origin and which owe their growth and prosperity to the gods or some major religious figure. What would be Varanasi without its gods and the myth of Lord Shiva, who is considered to be there himself, or Dwarka for that matter, the place of Lord Krishna, or Mathura, or Vrindavan, and Somnath. And then you talk about, when you go to south, then you would talk about places like Madurai, or Chidambra, and then there's so many places which owe everything to the gods there. Vaishno Devi, and there are plenty. Ujjain, again Lord Shiva. Calcutta, Goddess Kali. You cannot, talk about these places without mentioning about the great gods. If you go to Guwahati, Goddess Kamakhya. The list goes on and on in India, and. And just like in India for thousands of years, it was the same story even in Europe, where the rich and nobility and the aristocracy would it would actually contribute enormous amount of money as charity for the construction of these cathedrals. Like in India, you must have also seen a lot of people uh, who might not like to spend any amount of money on themselves, but would contribute crores and crores of rupees for the fancy temple which would be built somewhere, and they would contribute lakhs of rupees to some gurdwara which would be built somewhere else. So that is how it is in India, and it was the same story in other parts of the world as well. And this is what is being told here, that the whole because as I told you, cathedrals are massive churches, so naturally they took enormous amount of time to build. So when they were being built, you can understand there would be hundreds of laborers who would be working, contractors, then the people who would be supervising all that money, the contribution. So naturally small towns actually started evolving and developing around these cathedrals while they were even being built. And by the time they were completed, you had a full-fledged town. And Europe is full of these places, like the cathedrals. They have the cathedrals, and the whole world kind of develops around them. Cathedrals were designed so that the priest's voice could be heard clearly within. And students, one very important thing: the location of these cathedrals were not chosen in random. That suddenly you feel that there should be a cathedral in probably right in the middle of Rajpur Road or right in the center of Masuri Mall Road. No, yeah, the locations are not chosen randomly. Okay, there has to be a great religious significance about that place. Maybe some saint is buried there, or at some point in time some great saint had been there. He might have lived there for probably 5 or 10 years, and those areas and those particular locations become significantly important from the religious perspective or the point of view. And then probably some years later, or maybe centuries later, some people feel that yes, we should be having a cathedral here, we should build a cathedral here, and then the whole thing kind of is set into motion. So, cathedrals were designed so that the priest's voice could be heard clearly within the hall where large number of people gathered, and so that the singing by monks could sound beautiful, and the chiming bells called people to prayer could be heard over great distance. Stained glass was used for windows. During the day, the sunlight would make them radiant for people inside the cathedral, and after sunset, the light of the candles would make them visible to people outside. The stained glass windows narrated the stories in the Bible through pictures which illiterate people could read. Actually, and the intention was not just that to have a great and a great monument of affection and love towards Lord Jesus Christ, or towards the great saint who had been probably living there, but also to ensure that there were a lot of students. These were the places where it was not just the fact that you used to go for the prayers. No, we all know that whether you talk about temples or churches or gurdwaras, these are also centers of very, very important events in the life of common people. People get married there. People, once they died, their last visit to church is important. Their last visit to these places of religious significance is important. People get married. People, once a child is born, he is taken there for the father to so that the father can bless him. So all these events are important. And marriages also take place in these churches and these cathedrals. And if you must have watched it in the movies as well. Marriages happen in our temples. Marriages happen in these churches as well. So these places just not there that you open the doors only to pray to the gods, but it is also a great center of religious discussion, religious discourses, marriages, birth of children, death, all of that. So you have to understand it is same in all the cultures. It's not just in India, where you have massive temples which cater to different kinds of activities within the society, and but along with definitely the devotion towards the god. It was not just in India, it is a global phenomenon. The crisis of the 14th century.